Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Latin American Studies. This is the first event of the spring semester. For those of you who are already familiar with our programming, we are trying a new time for the class speaker series. Last in the fall, we did like lunchtime, and now we are trying this more happy hour, right? Just, we know that it's not always that we'll find people available, but, it's good to have this opportunity to change it a little bit and get more people. We have lots going on this semester, as always. If you don't receive our newsletter yet, please register at the website. There's a specific place where you can register. We're having on top of the lectures of the class speaker series, you have another one next week, actually, by Alessandra, who is there. And we're having an international conference on February 14th, Valentine's Day, on authoritarianism, memory, and human rights in Latin America. Very appropriate. But it's a very important conference. We're bringing wonderful scholars from different places in the US and in Latin America. So hope you can come and just stay connected to us. Now, today we have the wonderful pleasure to have Professor Andrea Peña-Vasquez, who recently joined the University of Pittsburgh at the GISPIA, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. She is an assistant professor of international affairs, and her main focus is on immigration and migration, issues of legal status and identity documentation, race and ethnicity, and migration governance in multi-level states. She comes here with a PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame, and a BA in political science too, and sociology from the University of Florida, and several visiting research positions and grants. So we are super happy that you joined us, and very much looking forward to hearing about that complicated topic that is more relevant than ever. So please, welcome Professor Peña-Vasquez. Thank you very much. So just we will talk for those of you who are not also familiar with the structure. She will give a talk, and then we'll just open up for conversation, questions. This is very informal. She will take the questions, and meanwhile, please make sure you eat, because if you don't, then we at CLAS will have to eat all this pizza, and it's never.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to kick off this speaker series. So yeah, I'll go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so let me just preface the outline. I'm gonna give a lot of background. It won't be like your typical research talk. And then I'll go into the research questions. I think it'll make more sense that way. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about the next steps in my research. And then, as mentioned, I'll open it up for discussion. This is very early stage work, but I figured this would be a really good audience to kind of get feedback on it for, and I look forward to questions and comments at the end. That being said, if there's any points of clarification throughout the talk, just feel free. Happy to answer. Okay, so a lot of immigration politics is really, sorry, I won't stand in front of it, is really concerned with issues of entry, right, and issues of legality. It's one of the functions of the state is to determine the conditions for entry and exit of both nationals and non-nationals, so citizens and non-citizens alike. These are major concerns that are really central to debates about the border in particular. And asylum is sometimes politicized and seen as this backdoor, right, that is being abused by economic migrants instead of legitimate refugees. Then we see a lot of this discourse, particularly in countries of the global north, like in Europe, the United States, where the notions of asylum have been, hyper politicized in really structuring this binary between sort of who is deserving of asylum and people who are, viewed as abusing the system. And so, as I mentioned, this bifurcation is central to debates about borders. And what this means is that states respond differently to each category, right? They respond differently to refugees than they do to economic migrants. The reason for this is because there is a global governance structure for refugees that does not exist for other immigrants. And the main difference between the two, one of which is the principle that is known as non-refoulement. Non-refoulement means that it's the principle that countries adhere to. It's an international norm that you won't send people back to countries where they might experience some sort of harm, right? A place that's considered dangerous, typically a war zone, a place where they might be persecuted upon their arrival. And so this is a right that's enshrined for people who have been designated as refugees, and not necessarily a right that's been enshrined for other immigrant groups. So, like I mentioned, this framework is really established. The cornerstone of this framework is the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol. The 1951 Convention really is the cornerstone. The protocol simply extends it to the original convention only applied to countries in Europe, and it had a very limited time frame. Events taking place before 1951, which was the time that it was elaborated. The protocol extended it. So basically, if you sign the protocol, you adhere to what's in the convention. And the way that it defines refugee is someone with a well-rounded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, and membership in a particular social group or political opinion. This definition has often been extended to people who are fleeing armed conflicts, right? Because of that danger in returning home. On the other hand, a migrant is oftentimes defined as someone who chooses to move, whether they're choosing to move for work, education, to rejoin their family members somewhere, so on and so forth. Important in that definition is that there's no direct threat, right, or persecution, and that there's no impediment to their return, right? They're free to come and go as they choose. So these both function as ideal types, right? Sociological literature, or I guess the scholarship, as well as law, really treats these two things as completely distinct, where you have refugees on one hand and you have migrants on the other. And what this means is that there's refugee systems and there's immigration systems. Now, the reality is much more complicated, where we see a lot more mixed flows, where there's people who are going to be moving for either reason. And we can just call them collectively displaced people, right? Some people, they might be moving all for the same reason, or rather, they might be involved in the same kind of large-scale movement. Some will be considered by some states as refugees, others will be considered migrants, but they're collectively together. And so when it comes to documentation, displaced people, a lot of times, for no reason, may not be able to obtain the documentation that they need to enter a country. This might be because the conditions, they leave middle of the night, or they were not able to get their government to provide the documentation they need for a visa, they can't afford things, a variety of reasons. And asylum systems are designed to pardon this, right? Where you should be, part of the right of granting asylum, of seeking asylum, is that you should be able to go to a country, regardless of whether you have that documentation needed to enter, state your case, and seek refuge. And then the state will determine whether or not they will allow you to enter. So asylum systems are sort of designed for these conditions, whereas immigration regimes are not. Immigration regimes are the rules that determine what is needed for entry, whether that's a particular visa. In some instances, it might be that you have a particular skill, right? So for Canada, that's the big thing. In the US, a lot of it is based off of family reunification. And so immigration systems are more determined at the national level of who they want to allow entry, whereas asylum systems are meant to adhere to that international framework that I mentioned. And so what happens when states use their immigration systems for displaced people is that displaced people then are at higher risk of irregularity, of entering without the appropriate authorization. And so irregularity, just a quick note, is characterized by high levels of uncertainty, right? And it exacerbates all different kinds of vulnerabilities. So some consequences include subject to detention or deportation, as well as exclusion from formal labor markets, which require people to work sort of under the table, as well as other types of exploitation, whether that's in the workplace or in housing policy, things of that nature. And there's a similar type of instability for people who have temporary statuses or uncertain legal statuses. So these uncertain legal statuses might be some that combine aspects of being documented and undocumented at the same time. So this is what Minhiva refers to as liminal legality. So one example would be TPS, right? Here in the United States, countries. So the way that TPS is afforded here in the United States is that the president determines a list of countries, where there are circumstances taking place where it is dangerous to return. It might be due to a natural disaster that has just taken place, or outbreak of a war, something along those lines. And that country is then added to that list. So that means that nationals of that country who are currently in the United States are then protected under this temporary regime. Because it's temporary, what happens is that regardless of what might be happening in that country, if the time runs out and it's not extended, then people who are unprotected under that status then become subject once again to being irregular. Does that make sense? And so rather than thinking about, legal and illegal, irregular, regular, undocumented, documented as these binaries, I argue that we should really think of them more as this gradient where there's different levels to it, right? And so when it comes to kind of migration crises, or rather large scale movements, these are typically sudden developments that result in just large scale, movements of people. They disrupt the status quo, and it justifies the implementation of these ad hoc responses that are due to an emergency, right? You have an emergency, you will respond in this sort of emergency type of way. And the notion is that a crisis is a temporal problem that will eventually fade and things will return either to normal or a new normal. The idea is that over time, the number of people arriving or the people there will decrease. But what about protracted crises? So crises that extend, far beyond the original expectations. So one such example is Venezuelans. Right now, it is the largest displacement crisis in the world. It has surpassed Syria as well as Ukraine, and it now enters its second decade. And so these should have been flipped. Well, no, these are fine. So estimates, these are from 2024, are that 7.89 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants out in the world, of which the overwhelming majority are in Latin America and the Caribbean. So 6.71 million remaining. And Venezuela's crisis is really different from other refugee crises as we know them. It's not necessarily the outbreak of a conflict, as was the case for Syria or Ukraine, and it's not it's not like the Uyghurs in China or the Rohingya in Myanmar, which are groups that are being persecuted for reasons of identity, right? For religious reasons or ethnic reasons. In fact, it's caused more by these intertwined social, economic, and political factors, which makes it more so that you have these mixed flows that really complicates things. And there are fairly low prospects of return despite economic growth. And so a lot of times Venezuelans had been characterized as sort of like economic migrants, in part because they were fleeing these deteriorating economic conditions in Venezuela. But there are also other reasons for their movement, right? This general instability, a lot of government repression, generalized violence. And so a lot of more recent pollings of displaced Venezuelans have found that regardless of the economic growth that we have seen and expected economic growth, there are very few intentions to return as long as the current regime is in place. And so going back again, it's these intertwined economic and political reasons that people have moved, and that will also determine, how people feel safe. Decisions to return, right, based off of feelings of safety. Like I mentioned, this has created these like mixed flows of people who would be determined to be refugees and people who would be determined to be migrants. Now, based off of the traditional 1951 definition that I mentioned, Venezuelans for the most part would not be considered refugees. Some might if they have particular experiences, those that are fleeing the regime due to differences in political opinions, they would certainly be considered refugees, but people who are fleeing because of, issues of their livelihood or that generalized violence would not. But Latin America has signed on to what is known as the Cartagena Declaration. And this was signed in 1984. They meet every 10 years to sort of revisit it. And it actually just met again December 2024 in Chile. And so this it's a regional instrument that extends the definition. It's a complement to the 1951 convention definition. So in addition to those categories that I mentioned prior, it includes people who have fled their country because their lives, security, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. And I would argue that 3 of these definitely apply to the case of Venezuela, right? There's been a lot of reports of this generalized violence, massive violation of human rights, and because of the economic deterioration, there's very little access to basic necessities, right? Like food and medicine, which have seriously disturbed that public order. However, despite this instrument, this definition has not been extended to Venezuelans in the region. So only a small fraction of Venezuelans have formally filed asylum applications, and a lot have opted instead for alternative sorts of documentation. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of asylum processes in Latin America, as well as elsewhere, are really time-consuming. They require a lot, it's like this big burden of proof for people who are applying for asylum. And the projected benefits, although they are greater, they are at this longer time horizon, right? So a lot of people, when given the option, they're going to choose the thing that allows them to have these more immediate benefits. And so Mexico and Brazil sort of stand out as 2 countries that have applied it and have granted Venezuelans asylum based off of the Cartagena Declaration. But most of the other countries in Latin America have responded to this influx through what are known as TPSAs, temporary protection or stay arrangements. I refer to them as toleration statuses because they effectively tolerate the presence of kind of displaced people, but it's not like the same sort of formal asylum process as we know it. And so this is an example of one of them, kind of what it looks like. And so these are meant to be complements to the international refugee regime, right? The idea was not every country is signed onto this refugee regime, the same framework. And so these countries that aren't signatories to them, that don't abide to it, could be able to provide this sort of temporary protection, and it's better than nothing, right? But it was never meant to replace the regime that's current, that exists. And for Latin America, it's even more notable that having, signed the convention, as well as having this additional instrument, that both choices have been foregone for these more temporary types of protections. On one hand, they've been praised as this pragmatic approach, right, for dealing with a crisis. Once again, if you have this crisis, then that justifies having this ad hoc emergency response. But in the long term, it's not the most effective. It actually results in lesser protections than would be granted to refugees if they were given that full status as refugees. And not only that, but their discretionary and political nature also means that they're easily modified or potentially revoked. And we've seen that in some cases where it's been made more difficult to access, or it's been made, only for this amount of time, and then there's no alternative option. And that would not be the case if they were granted asylum to begin with. And so ultimately what this shows is a serious erosion of asylum as an institution. And not to say that this is limited to Latin America, because this is a worldwide trend, but it's particularly notable in this case because, as I mentioned, this is the world's largest kind of displacement crisis, and you have all of these different instruments. So to give some examples, and I probably should have made this into a table, but Colombia originally had given this 2-year specialist permit stay, and then it extended it to 10 years. And this one's been known as kind of the most innovative in the region because it's such a long time horizon. Peru also passed one before they then implemented kind of these more stringent entry requirements. Brazil, prior to really adopting the Cartagena Declaration, had also provided these 2-year residency permits. Argentina and Uruguay, since they're both members of Mercosur, which is like a smaller equivalent, South American equivalent to the EU, provided these temporary visas. Paraguay had also done one, as well as Ecuador and Chile. And so these are just some examples, but there were plenty others that happened kind of during the bulk of these policies. And so what I really wanted to highlight, though, is that there were varying degrees of both accessibility and of the rights granted. So some, because they required the involvement of Venezuelan authorities, either to provide, evidence of no criminal record, or they needed to be, applied for in Venezuela at these consular agencies, then that made it more difficult, right, for people to access and to be able to enter through regular means. It made it less accessible, and it really just heightened the risk of people leaving Venezuela and entering kind of without papers, right, being already branded as undocumented upon entry. Others charged fees to access some visas or permits, and these ranged from $14, which I think was Peru, to $220. Once again, you're talking about a case of economic deterioration, hyperinflation, that is not necessarily accessible to people who are being displaced. Some of them did have pathways to permanent residency or naturalization, but others were very strict about, at the end of this period, that's it. Or it might be renewable, but having this sort of continuous renewal made it so that they were kind of constantly in this legal limbo, right? Where you can't necessarily plan for the future if you're constantly thinking about, what might happen a year from now. All of them did provide access to the formal labor market, but there were a lot of differences in how kind of generous they were as far as access to healthcare, education, and other social services. And so there was a lot of kind of variability there. So, like I said, a lot of background. And this is still very early stage of research, but the things that I'm really interested in is kind of what explains the designs of these sort of policies. Why did some countries decide to provide more rights and protections than others? Is it a function of state capacity, or is it something more political, informed kind of by public opinion or the number of Venezuelans that they were receiving? Because the question of why did they go this route has kind of been attributed to the flexibility, right, in being discretionary, allowing oftentimes the executive to, have this program, allow these residence permits, but then revoke them or modify them if need be. They're much more flexible, and they don't have any oversight the same way that, asylum does, because asylum is governed, like I said, by this international framework, but also there's a lot of oversight through the UNHCR, which is the UN's refugee agency. But that doesn't necessarily explain why we see this sort of variability in how these programs are designed. So sort of the next steps that I have planned are to kind of map out the different policies and then choose, among them for case selection, identify kind of what would be the best primary and secondary data sources. So I'm thinking like parliamentary records, and things of that nature, and then potentially process tracing, but I'm undecided. So I look forward just to the feedback. And with that, I'll wrap it up. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
This is so fascinating, Andrea. Do you have any sense of like what happened in Brazil, like how they went from the temporary like residency to the like asylum? Because if I mean, it's just kind of a surprising case given some of the other like electoral things that have happened in Brazil.
Yes. Okay. So the thing about the Brazil case that's particularly interesting is that when that shift happened during Bolsonaro, and so the expectation typically is like a right-wing leader is going to be kind of less open to immigration, but the reason a lot of scholars have argued that the reason why Brazil was so open to immigration at that time was particularly because they were coming from Venezuela, and so being a left-wing dictatorship, states are more likely to accept refugees from countries that they consider to be, maybe enemy is not the right word, but antithetical to their political leanings, as a way to kind of like stick it to their political opponents, and that countries are less likely to accept refugees from countries that they consider allies. And so that's partly why we saw kind of Brazil having this more welcoming response to Venezuelans. But it's notable in this case that it was because it was particularly Venezuelans. They have not been as open to other refugee groups. And I would say that, I mean, in this case, I focus on Venezuela because, like I said, it's the largest, but almost all countries have been very reluctant to accept Haitian refugees, even though the conditions kind of in Venezuela and Haiti are pretty comparable. Thank you for the question. Yes.
Hi, Andrea, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have some doubts. First, about the asylum that you told us. What are the rights that people have when they get this this protection? Yeah, and how does it apply in the income of these people? Can they work in the country? is it different from country to country, or yeah, I'm thinking about how these people survive and if they can work, things like that. And the other thing I was thinking, especially about the Venezuela migrants. And do you have researches about the profile of the migrants? Because, for example, you have a lot of people from some provinces in Venezuela, rich provinces that are against Maduro. And these people leave Venezuela, but they have another profile. For example, high, medium class, things like that. And you have other different people that really leaves Venezuela, not only more for economical reasons as well, but they are low class or working class, things like that. And I think this profile also impacts the way the people can get or not all this status. So if you can talk more about this profile.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'll start with your first question of what are the protections that come with asylum? And these don't vary as much because generally refugees are kind of, I wish I had a marker, but in the sort of status hierarchy, are there? Okay, well, it's a very simple kind of drawing, but basically if we think of sort of citizenship as this hierarchy, typically, you know, citizens are up at the top. People who are considered irregular or undocumented would be at the bottom. And this all reflects kind of relationship to the state. And then in the middle, you might have legal permanent residents. And then you have typically refugees kind of around the same era. And then you have sort of people in these liminal statuses. And so a lot of times they'll have the same kind of rights and protections as people who are legal permanent residents, which would imply kind of access to full labor markets and all the other social services that are granted to people who are kind of not necessarily quite citizens yet, but have the opportunity to become citizens. So usually they're just above, and they're definitely far above people who are irregular, right? What this means for income, so part of that is access to the formal labor market. That I think is perhaps more important in advanced industrial democracies like the US, like Western Europe, like Australia, Canada, et cetera, where you have a larger formal labor market compared to a relatively smaller informal labor market. And let's say we don't have an informal labor market. And with the rise of the gig economy, you know, things like Uber Eats and deliveries, we're seeing a growth in that. But there's still a lot of like formal jobs that are regulated by the state. The same is not quite the case in Latin America as of yet, where you have these large informal labor markets. And despite being able to access it, a lot of people with status will still work in that informal labor market. So I think that as a right is perhaps less important. And what's more important is the access to those social services, rather than kind of access to the formal labor market, which in the US, if you're sort of documented, if you have status, then you're more likely to be in that formal state regulated market. But in a lot of countries of the global South, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, parts of Asia, then even people who have status are still involved in that informal labor market. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, the second question about the profile of migrants, I think is so interesting because some of the, there's not a whole lot of information on this. I mean, there's more so now than there was before, but some people have found that the profile of people going to Colombia and Peru, the more proximate locations, were fleeing more so due to economic reasons. And those that were fleeing to further away places, like, I mean, I guess Brazil, not so much, but like Brazil and Chile were more so fleeing because of the political reasons. And I think it's also a matter of stage. So this is, like I said, been a protracted crisis, and the exodus of Venezuelans have taken place over the past decade. And so those who left earlier, a lot of times were of higher economic backgrounds. This is what typically happens. And people who are able to sort of afford flights. So that's why when you have things like GPS, it tends to privilege kind of wealthier refugees who are still fleeing kind of the same conditions, but there's a lot of resources that are needed to migrate, right? And so those that are able to will fly rather than walk. And so that impacts sort of when they leave, how they leave, and where they will go. A lot of people who ended up in Chile ended up being or having higher levels of education than the native kind of host population. And this has caused a lot of issues, both in terms of job competition, but also there's a lot of underemployment because of that. And I think that has affected like negative public opinion. For Brazil, I do know that it's mostly from one particular region, which I think is interesting. But I'm not entirely sure how that impacts it yet, because I haven't like fully looked into it, but I think it's like interesting and worthy of note. Yeah, thank you.
Before I ask my actual question, what's the region of Brazil in question that we're talking about here?
It's something I cannot pronounce. I can't quite remember. I had it in my show notes, but I don't remember.
Okay. So my actual question is more about the methods here. So you mentioned the potential variables as state capacity, political. I'm guessing that means like political polarization or debate over the topic of migration, and then public opinion, which I would assume that refers to say like changes in the electorate and how that affects like elections at the executive level.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking more so. I mean, I haven't thought it as detailed, but I was thinking more like, well, some of it are like due to kind of like, okay, what can the state do? And others are more like, this is a choice. And public opinion being like what
capacity versus commitment then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And like the favorability. So, and these are things that also change over time. So originally
and one another as well.
Yeah. So people at first are very like, welcome refugees. And then over time, the crisis kind of protracts, and then public opinion, there's notions of like, oh, they're criminals, they're changing, our culture and things like that. And so that's more so what I meant. I was like, public opinion, not so much about like whether they should be temporary or not, and whether this is the correct kind of strategy, but rather overall kind of like feeling thermometers of like, how do you feel about, Venezuelan migrants?
Okay, because my question was going to be, how do we operationalize these other than state capacity? But it sounds to me like you're looking more at, because you mentioned also looking at like congressional procedural reports, I think it was. So we're looking more at like, because we have 7 cases, right?
Well, I haven't chosen the cases yet, and that's what I was hoping to kind of get some feedback on. If you have any like,
there's a bias towards Brazil in this room, by the way. Just letting you know.
I could tell, and I think that Brazil would for sure. It seems like that would be like a logical case.
Yeah.
To go back to your earlier question, I know that the region is bordering. It's a bordering region, and I think it starts with an R, which it'd be like so. Yes.
There's two that starts with the nerve, either Rondônia or Roraima.
I think it's that one, Roraima.
Roraima,
Yeah, I think it's that one. So yeah, but sorry, I'll get to you in a second.
No.
Okay, so I have not fully committed to whether this is going to be a qualitative or quantitative research. Or mixed design. Yeah, because I think of myself more as like a mixed method scholar, anyways. And I have this broader research project on regularization. And so when I was in the process of preparing this presentation, I came across a lot of work that refers to these kinds of temporary stay agreements as regularizations. And I don't think that they are. So it's unclear, like I haven't fully decided, and this is like insight to the research process where you have to make some choices. And they're not always like super apparent to you. At the moment, I really am in the thick of it. And so I'm not sure if this project will be kind of like subsumed under that broader regularization project, or if this will be its own thing, because I originally thought of this as something separate from regularization. Regularization, sorry, I forgot to define it, is basically the process by which a state changes your status, basically, and this administrative status from being irregular to regular, which, yes, is the case for some of these, but not for all of them. So that's why I can't decide. I'm really grappling with that. I do think it's such an interesting case that I'm like leaning towards doing qualitative research, because I think that's more fun. But and I think it would make sense to kind of like really dig deep into like a set of particular cases of like, okay, it could look like this, it could look like that, and these were the choices that led to, these were the, you know, the how the process ended up being this way. So to still not answer your question, what I'm thinking is potentially the quantitative part will help me choose the case selection, and then I'll do the qualitative research on the cases.
It's what my PI does, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's like that's what people do. Yeah, thank you for your question.
I know this might not be like your focus at all, and if you're like, I have no idea, that's totally fine. I was just curious.
Thank you for the preface.
Yes, but you mentioned how to Brazil, sorry.
Yeah.
There is, and we see this throughout Latin America and the US as well, it's way harder for Haitians to get refugee status.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about the Brazilian context for this. Do you think there is a historical and anthropological and racial component to that? Because Brazil and Haiti have very different histories, but very similar ones as well. And with how, you know, like Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Haiti had a really big slavery role. Brazil is the blackest country outside of Africa. And there is a lot of racial tension in Brazil. How do we see that reflect the policies towards Haitian refugees, or the lack thereof?
That's a great question. So there's a paper that was about this, not only about Brazil, but it focused a lot on Brazil. And it's interesting that you mentioned this history, because it also talked about Brazil being involved in kind of peacekeeping missions back in Haiti. And so I think it's hard to make a definitive answer when a lot of Haitians have not applied for formal asylum. And I think it's this like endogenous question where like part of the reason they don't apply is because it's so difficult. And the state does not make it easier for them to apply. And I remember I came across, I think when Colombia rolled out its new program, they really encouraged Venezuelans to apply for it. But what that meant is that even those that had been applying for formal asylum then leave that behind, because you end up applying for one, not the other. And so in this way, it discourages people from applying for asylum. The cultural stuff, I haven't really seen a whole lot of research about it, about like the nitty gritty and like historical stuff, but I have seen arguments made about the racial component, and that generally Haitians are not considered to be like refugees in the same way that Venezuelans are. And part of it, I think, is like that commitment. Some of it could be like concerns over demographic change, because we also see the case with African kind of asylum seekers, not just in Latin America, but in other contexts. So I think that that's why it's difficult to determine whether it's something that's specific to Brazil or specific to Latin America, because we live in an anti-Black world. So we see these things like percolate outside of these cases. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope I answer any questions. That's always my hope in the classroom and elsewhere. Yes.
So recently Brazil changed the immigrants law. We used to have the Estatuto do Imigrante, and in 2017, this law was changed for Lei do Imigrante. And this law, like the previous law was placed for over 40 years
Mhm.
and was very nationalist and conservative. And when it changed, it were much more, the new law in 2017 were aligned to like more international human rights and the principles of human rights, and to place the immigrants a little bit more like against discriminations to immigrants. And after that law, like everything changed domestically. So changing the policy domestically was something that really helped Brazil to have and receive and more in a welcome way those immigrants and accept them. One example is that the federal police that is responsible to the control of immigrants in Brazil, instead of, for example, if an immigrant enters using a fake document, they would be committing a crime based on the former law. The new law says that's just an administrative violation. So this has helped their condition to stay in the country. So changing the law in Brazil, like domestically, was something that helped Brazil to receive or to be more aligned with human rights policies. Do you think that other countries are in the same path of changing the law, or if this is something that's going to be present in your research, like observe the domestic laws in other countries in order to better receive those immigrants?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely important, and the timing is so perfect because this was in 2017, you said, and that's one of the spikes that we've seen as far as like rise in kind of Haitian or Venezuelan migration. I think that so there have been studies that compared Brazil and their change to their immigration law with Chile's change to their immigration law, because they both are considered kind of more progressive. But then there's other scholars who think that it's like, yeah, it's more progressive in these ways, but it really detracts from like how we see, like it's progressive on paper, but not always necessarily in the implementation. But on the other hand, Brazil has been kind of recognized as this leader, particularly by the UNHCR, of kind of serving as this model for kind of hosting refugees. Because like I said, it was Mexico and Brazil that decided to apply the Cartagena Declaration, but Brazil was first. But I think that these changes in domestic policy, they definitely would have to be accounted for in this research. And this is kind of what makes it difficult, because this is something that has happened over time, which is why I'm leaning towards the qualitative, because that kind of stuff gets, you study it more easily, like it appears more, it sometimes gets hidden when you do quantitative research. But then the challenge is still about this question of implementation. So I'm not sure what to do about that part. But sorry, I deviated from the question. There was something else I wanted to say. All right, it's the end of the day. But that the changes in domestic immigration law, I think, still highlight this issue of countries using their immigration laws as opposed to, like sticking to the asylum regime that we have, which is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's more expansive than these sort of individual immigration like policies that we have. Thank you for your question. I don't know if I actually answered it. Okay, thank you.
No, I'm also curious about the public opinion. If you have any research about the public opinion in these countries about because you said that sometimes they suffer prejudice and things like that. And we had in Brazil a really polemic case, I think 3 years ago, about Cesare Battisti. I don't know if you read about it. He is an Italian writer, and he was convicted in Italy for joining a an army struggle organization in the 70s. So he was convicted in Italy, and the Italian government asked his deportation. But during a long time, the Brazilian government gave him the asylum status. But when Bolsonaro became the president, he took out in the first year, he took out Battista's status of asylum, and he escaped and was arrested. He was arrested in, I think it was in Bolivia. Yeah. And then this case, mobility, I don't know how to say, but the public opinion were really, worried about the case and talking a lot about it, especially because for some people, he was a terrorist. Yeah, so I would like to know if you have any searches about like public opinion and how sometimes the governments.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll be truthful, I don't work in public opinion because it's just too, I don't know, it's really messy. But one note about this particular case is that it highlights, so this is a very rare kind of case, because generally asylum, once it's granted, it's not revoked. And the reason, so the exceptions though are if you make the case that this person is a danger, like to the public, and it would be the case if they're deemed a terrorist. There's like these minor kind of exceptions for when a state could revoke the asylum of a person. And so this is definitely one of them. But I think that in general, the public opinion, I wouldn't say it's that it has changed like up and down, but rather I think it's been generally steadily decreasing for Venezuelans. Because I don't think, I mean, maybe there's some spikes, particularly around the election times, right? Where people are once again reminded like, oh, elections in Venezuela, as opposed to, changes in like, I guess the other thing is like, if there's high profile events, like was the case here in the US, like the really I should know this, but the really hyper politicized case of the migrant who like killed somebody.
Lincoln Riley.
Yes, thank you. Things like that, they sometimes shift public opinion a little bit, but those tend to be blips rather than kind of like trends that we can really analyze. And so I think that, like, I haven't looked at that yet, but I imagine that like when a crisis sort of extends over time, the longer that people are kind of displaced, just the more negative public opinion is, because they are like, okay, we thought, this goes back to that crisis mentality and the crisis narrative, which is stoked both from above and below, where it's like, oh, this is temporary, like, we're helping people, but it's like having the treatment is more of having a guest. You don't expect guests to sort of overstay their welcome. And so I think that is, also happening there. That's how I explain it in my class. I was gonna say, I could teach a whole class on this, and in fact I do. So just downstairs. Yeah. Asylum politics and policy. And mostly and particularly related to that like bifurcation between like us refugee and migrant. Because I think that also it has really important implications, like the ways that Venezuelans have been in some ways highlighted as refugees, or I think it's more, we do tend to use the term somewhat interchangeably, but it's not, but sometimes it is. And maybe it should be, and maybe it shouldn't be. There's arguments to be made for both. Yeah.
I have two, one question. I don't think either of them really will be helpful, but I'm not sure how they are to like your research process, but I'm curious on like a smaller level. So you were talking about the program in Colombia, and it sounds like, at least at the time, you could either apply for this like TPSA or asylum, but you couldn't be applying for both at the same time.
Yeah.
Which I guess is distinct from the US where you could have both.
Yes,
Okay,
but you don't apply for TPS in the US.
right, you're right,
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
And then I guess sort of like on a broader scale, I'm just like sort of intrigued by the argument that I guess some scholars make that temporary status is some sort of regularization and like what, I guess like how, like what is like the basis of that? I'm just curious like how people make that, how scholars make that argument.
You know, that's a great question, and truthfully, I don't know. Because, okay, and this is the issue, is that we don't have this like clear definition of what regularization is as a concept. It's like democracy. It's like we know what it is, sort of, but like we don't really know. Like there's all these different kinds of arguments for like, there's deliberative democracy and there's other democracy, and I'm from Notre Dame, so this is partly why I'm like, that's the first example that comes to mind. Because they hosted the Varieties of Democracy project. But I think that part of why there's a lot of confusion is because it hasn't been determined. I tend to think of regularization in this more narrow way, that where you move from this to here, as opposed to like here to here. Like, so it's, for me, it's not just about change in administrative status, but like really going from irregular to regular. And I guess for some people, that would be the case if they enter kind of through irregular means, and then they are granted this TPSA where they then are regular, but it's still temporary. And so it still remains the question of, is permanence a necessary and sufficient condition for it to be a regularization? Or is it enough that it's, you know, just moving you from being irregular to regular, even if it's temporary, or even if it's renewable? Because that's the other thing about these uncertain statuses, where you're regular, but only if you're able to maintain it, right? Because there could be changes in the policy that then you're regular the first time you apply, and then it's time to renew and the requirements have changed. Or, you know, they say like, oh, now you can only renew if you get this document from the Venezuelan consulate. And it's like, well, if Venezuela closed consular relations here, then how are we gonna, it's not always pragmatic. But I think that, so that's what my other project's about, kind of the conceptual boundaries of what regularization is. And I am not convinced that all of these count as regularizations because of their temporary nature. I think that there has to be some sort of pathway to permanence for it to really count as a regularization. Otherwise, the term is just moot to me. And that's the argument I'm gonna make. We have 1 minute left for questions. My brain shuts off at 5:30 on the dot.
I just, going back to Brazil, which I said I didn't want to talk about, or nor do I want you to talk about, because.
I knew my audience when I walked in,
Yeah,
so it's okay, I can prepare.
Be aware, Brazilians are, you know, they're not like Americans, they're not ignorant to countries outside of their own, they just kind of pretend to be.
They're like the Nigerians.
So.
Expand on that.
Yeah, forget my question, I want to hear this.
You're like, Nigerians love to talk about Nigeria, and it's like, I love it too, it's great. There's other countries.
I was gonna ask about the very porous language barrier with Brazil because of the, you know, that they do speak Portuguese there. I know Portuguese, Spanish, you know, mutually intelligible, but I would reckon that might be some kind of factor, at least in the decision to go.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's hard to say because on one hand, people, so generally the way people choose where to go is like if they have connections there, like networks is like the biggest thing.
Chain migration.
Yeah. For all sorts of reasons, because it like really facilitates migration. But then I guess when it comes to asylum, right, and like displacement, typically it's the proximate countries. And so for Brazil, it seems that, like I said, most the Venezuelans are from the areas that border Brazil. And so it's really a consequence of proximity. But then for the people that were fleeing because of political reasons, generally, I don't know what the overlap of the Venn diagram between like kind of economically privileged and people who are fleeing for political reasons is in Venezuela, but I imagine that there's quite a bit of overlap. And so I would think that, you know, that also allows them to get a little bit further if necessary. I don't know if like, so there's mixed research on whether policies in the receiving country actually impact decisions to migrate. It seems like that has very little because the results have been kind of mixed. So I don't think it would be like because, oh, Brazil is like welcoming Venezuelans that they would choose to go there, but rather like, oh, I think that's very minor as far as the decision-making calculus. I think it's more so like either issues of proximity or just resources. And I think, sorry, one last point that I did forget to make in my presentation is that part of the reason that so people had arrived, you know, to these other countries in Latin America. Like I said, most Venezuelans are still hosted in the region, but a lot of people who had originally, you know, been in Colombia, been in Brazil and elsewhere, then began moving northward, particularly post 2018. But now it seems like with changing administration, it's unclear kind of what will happen. So I think that, but part of the reason why they started moving is because of the economic conditions in other Latin American countries where they were like, oh, I left Venezuela because of the because of the instability there. I don't want to face that instability again in Argentina, for instance, right? And so that's kind of like another challenge that we have where these host countries are grappling with kind of their own social, economic, and political issues that perhaps that's what informs these sort of temporary stay agreements. But I think that conditions are due to change because of what's happening in the US. Yeah.
In Brazil also, we have one particular ethnic group that 6% of the Venezuelans that are in Brazil right now, we call Guarau. This group, it is exactly from the border, and they literally cross walking the border, so massive groups of people. So Brazil had to move quickly to document these people or create ways to receive them. And those people literally walked through all those states in the north of Brazil, crossing, getting to the borders of the coast of Brazil and the northeast and other areas of Brazil. And the states, they have to work policies, state level and municipality level to accept those people. They're from this ethnic group, so they're literally very indigenous people. And then those people were placed in the streets and the population started to see those people. So they had to move fast to receive and working in areas that those people could be placed in like shelters and receiving them. And after that, they starting getting accepted, they bring in more family to those areas. So they're literally concentrated from the border and crossing. They call Guarau. It's a ethnic group from Venezuela. They're more concentrated in Brazil.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that it goes kind of back to that point of like these being like very pragmatic, like this is what you do in an emergency. But once again, like when conditions change or don't change, then we still have to adapt these policies. And yeah, I think that prospects of returning, like I think, and this will be the last thing I say because I know I'm going over time, but I think that a lot of times when we think about refugee return, it's like, oh, it's this catch-22 where on one hand, a place needs people to go back in order to rebuild, bless you. But on the other hand, it's like, can you really compel people to return when conditions aren't safe? So it's really this like tug and pull of like, yes, it's not a war zone per se, and it's not a country that's been, you know, debilitated by a natural disaster, but the economy is not enough to like, but the economy also is like, it needs people in order to improve, but then you're forcing people to go back to a place where it's not viable necessarily to live. And yeah, it's all complicated. But thank you for your attention. Thank you for the feedback and for the questions. I really appreciated this discussion. And yeah, don't be a stranger. Here's my contact info. I'm downstairs. So yeah, I look forward to chatting some more.